When Trump threatened to start a trade war with China during last year's election campaign, there was a pretty broad consensus that China was in trouble. Chinese exporters rely heavily on the American market. The Chinese economy was looking shaky, and most of the inflationary impact on the US would probably be absorbed by the strong dollar. Unfortunately for Trump, however, this isn't how things have panned out. The dollar is weakening, America's economy now looks like the shaky one, and it turns out China has more leverage in this trade war than most commentators originally thought. So, in this video, we're going to look at the escalating US-China trade war, who's winning, and what might happen next. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. So let's just start with a quick overview of all the tariffs Trump has imposed on China since coming into office. Because, well, it can be hard to keep track. Even before Trump took office, the average US tariff on Chinese imports was about 20%. This was largely a consequence of tariffs imposed by Trump in his first term, focused on certain commodities like steel and strategically sensitive goods like solar panels. For context, the average US tariff for imports from the rest of the world was about 3%. However, in his second term, Trump has taken things up a notch, sparking an unprecedented tit-for-tat trade war with Beijing. This really began on February the 1st, when Trump imposed a flat 10% tariff on all Chinese imports, on top of the pre-existing tariffs. 3 days later, China retaliated with a 15% tariff on coal and liquefied natural gas imports from the US, as well as a 10% tariff on crude oil, agricultural machinery, and large displacement cars. On March the 3rd, Trump added another 10%. Again, China retaliated with more tariffs on certain US agricultural exports. On April the 2nd, otherwise known as Liberation Day, Trump slapped a further 34% tariff on all Chinese imports. 2 days later, China retaliated with a symmetrical 34% tariff. On April the 7th, Trump threatened another 50%. On April the 9th, China retaliated by preemptively adding another 50% itself, taking China's flat tariff rate on US imports to 84%. On April the 10th, Trump upped the stakes by taking America's flat tariff rate on all Chinese imports up to 145%. And on April the 11th, China went to 125%, effectively ending bilateral trade between the world's two biggest economies. Now, originally, the Trump administration seemed pretty confident about all this. Earlier this week, Trump claimed that the ball is in China's court. China needs to make a deal with us. We don't have to make a deal with them. His Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told CNBC that, quote, China are playing with a pair of twos. What do we lose by the Chinese raising tariffs on us? We export 1/5 to them of what they export to us. The basic argument here seems to be that the US runs a massive trade deficit with China, which means Chinese businesses need access to the American market more than vice versa. There's definitely some truth to this, and most economists originally expected a trade war to hurt China more than America. The Peterson Institute for International Economics estimated last year, for instance, that if both countries imposed a 60% flat tariff on each other, China's GDP would shrink by $770 billion, while America's would only shrink by $327 billion. However, that's not quite how things have panned out. In fact, Trump has quickly pulled back on a number of tariffs, including a huge exemption for cell phones, computer equipment, and many electronic components, representing nearly a quarter of all Chinese imports, and is now requesting negotiations. On Tuesday, Bessent penned a piece in the Wall Street Journal essentially asking America's allies to help the US isolate China economically. But it got little traction, because, well, America doesn't have that many friends at the moment. Conversely, China is sounding increasingly confident. Bloomberg reported on Wednesday that Beijing is now insisting that Trump show more, quote, consistency and respect before any talks, and that Xi himself won't bother with preliminary talks until it looks like a deal is actually possible. Beijing also apparently wants Trump to, quote, rein in members of his cabinet, a thinly veiled reference to J.D. Vance's provocative comment about Chinese peasants earlier this month. And China Daily, the CCP's English language mouthpiece, told the US to, quote, stop whining in an editorial earlier this week. So why aren't things going to plan for Trump here? Well, as we see it, there are at least 4 reasons. For starters, China relies less on the US than it used to. In 2018, at the start of the first trade war, the US accounted for 20% of China's total exports, but this figure has since fallen to about 13%. Second, while American exporters might not suffer that much, American consumers still want a lot from China, which means that, combined with a weak dollar, the trade war could push up inflation to politically unpalatable levels. This speaks to Trump's somewhat one-sided view of trade deficits. While it's true that Chinese businesses sell a lot of stuff to America, that's because American consumers like Chinese stuff. Both countries are sort of dependent on one another in this respect, as Trump's recent exemptions for smartphones tacitly admits. Of course, China's retaliatory tariffs will also lead to higher inflation in China, but A, inflation is currently lower in China than it is in the US, and B, it's not like disgruntled Chinese can vote Xi out at the midterms. This takes us nicely onto the third reason. The politics of a trade war are easier for the CCP. Not only does Xi not have to worry about re-election, America's aggressive posture also means that the CCP can easily blame everything on Trump. Conversely, many Americans will be asking why Trump has chosen to inflict so much economic pain on them, given he came to office promising to bring down the price of groceries. And fourth, while China might struggle in a tit-for-tat tariff-based trade war, it has other economic weapons at its disposal. Just this week, for instance, China cancelled all Boeing orders, heaping more pressure on the American airline giant, and suspended the export of certain critical materials and magnets to the US. These are essential to a whole range of advanced manufacturing sectors, and speaks to another asymmetry in the US-China trade relationship. While China mainly imports agricultural products from the US, which can easily be sourced from other countries like Brazil, the US relies on China for a whole range of critical manufacturing components and commodities, which can't be easily sourced elsewhere. In the worst-case scenario, China could also dump its holding of US debt, including treasuries and other agency bonds, potentially sparking a full-blown debt crisis. All in all, it's clear that Trump's trade war isn't going to plan. For Trump, this is bad news in and of itself, but it's also bad because it's shown to America's other trading partners that A, you can win a trade war against the US, and B, even Trump ultimately caves to domestic political pressure. Regardless, in 2025, one thing is certain. We can expect the news cycle to continue being dominated by these same major figures. But who's the most influential? In the most recent edition of our magazine, Too Long, we find out. That's because this 72-page issue runs down our official ranking of the world's most influential people, a vote which saw the TLDR team and more than 15,000 of you casting ballots. In the magazine, you'll learn the entire ranking. Plus, we've written articles about all of the top 25, discussing how they wield their influence and how they interact with and shape our world. That includes Modi's struggles in South India, how Elon took over, Giorgia Meloni's battles with the Italian judiciary, and Trump's monumental comeback story. Also, if you want to dive even deeper, the premium edition of the magazine also gets you access to bonus videos. That includes the team debating the ranking of their top 25, with it getting pretty heated at times.
We could potentially have a monumental jump on our hands.
Yeah.
Hands up for leapfrogging into sixth.
The most powerful European country, the second biggest economy, the nuclear power that is... The nuclear power!
Yeah.
We also recorded the team's reaction to the audience's rankings, so you can find out what they really think about your votes. It's not just about the most influential people either. Too Long also contains articles about the current state of the UK, the new right in Europe, and if peace can really hold in Gaza, along with a whole variety of other stories. Too Long is truly some of our very best journalism, with the audience consistently saying that previous issues vastly outstrip their expectations. So if you want a copy too, head over to toolong.news to pick one up. And if you never want to miss an issue, you can subscribe, which also gets you a 20% discount on every issue as long as you stay a subscriber. Plus, just this week, if you use code INFLUENCE, you'll get an additional £3 off any subscription. Too Long helps to fund our journalism year-round, and also allows us to keep all of our YouTube videos free. So we really do appreciate your support.